Hello, I'm Bob Trubshaw. I'd like to talk to you about alabaster, gypsum and plaster. And some of you are probably thinking that's almost tautological, because alabaster is especially good quality gypsum, and plaster is something made from gypsum. Indeed, that's true. And, well, historical sources frequently conflate the three different words, even to the extent of referring to plaster pits when it's not plaster itself which is being dug out of the ground, but the gypsum from which plaster is made. If you're not familiar with gypsum and want to get some idea of what it feels like, then the so-called chalk used on school blackboards is actually compressed gypsum. Alabaster is an especially fine form of gypsum. It carves and polishes very nicely. It's been used for sculpture in ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, classical Rome, and the Byzantine Empire. It's what sculptures were made from before marble was imported into Britain. These superb effigies in the chancel of Bottesford Church depict members of the Manners family, who in due course became first the Earls of Rutland and later still the Dukes of Rutland. They're carved from alabaster. The oldest example that we know of for carved alabaster in England is over at Tutbury. It's actually outside, which is even more remarkable because alabaster doesn't weather very well. It's the 12th century doorway of what's now the parish church, but was originally a priory church, and it uses some local alabaster as part of this arch. Not so far away at Hanbury is the first of the alabaster memorials. This one commemorates John de Hanbury, who died either 1280 or 1300. It's the best evidence we have for people in the 13th century extracting alabaster and gypsum from the Tutbury area. We know also that in medieval times Nottingham was famous for workshops producing low-relief religious scenes to go behind altars, and also different types of sepulchral effigies. These were all from alabaster, and in more recent centuries alabaster has been used for high-status ornamental work of various kinds. It's just that the quarrying techniques no longer produce alabaster-grade gypsum. Where did the alabaster from these effigies in Bottesford come from? Well, the best guess is that it's actually from the next village, a village to the west, Orston. Bottesford is in Leicestershire, Orston is just across the county boundary in Nottinghamshire. And according to the Nottinghamshire volume of the Victoria County History, the gypsum from Orston was, I quote, the finest in the kingdom. We know that gypsum extraction in Orston goes back quite some centuries, because there was a payment of 8 shillings and 4pence by the Earl of Rutland in 1541. He was settling up his debts for 20 tons of plaster supplied by Nicholas North of Orston. Now, maybe a few years before that, in 1502, 62 tons of plaster supplied to Collie Weston might have been supplied from Orston too, but it's not specifically stated. Now, the oldest known gypsum quarries, which were simply referred to as plaster pits, were near the centre of the village at Orston. These former pits were backfilled in probably the late 19th century, and they're now just part of people's gardens. Since the spring of 2022, I've lived in a house converted from 3 cottages built in the mid-19th century to house gypsum miners and their families. This row of cottages in Chapel Street was built at the same time for the same reason. Set behind them is this property, now a single dwelling, but originally 3 small cottages. And this is the back view of an almost identical property adjoining, again once 3 cottages but now 1 house. Between where I'm standing and the road, there was another row of cottages. They were demolished and the garage and other outbuildings erected in their place. This is most likely to have been around 1950, although it could have been earlier. So apart from the quarries in the village, in 1860 the Royal Plaster Works was set up near Orston. This is away from the village and it's next to the Grampound to Nottingham railway line, very handy for transporting the gypsum and the plaster. This so-called manufactory was considered the most efficient and modern in Europe in 1865. But modern and efficient it might have been, but it struggled to make any profits until 1897, largely because until 1897 the gypsum was being mined rather than extracted by open cast digging. There was a change of ownership, change of management in 1897, the underground mining ceased and open cast quarrying commenced. The overburden of clay was used to make bricks, tiles and drainage pipes. It's reckoned that between 1868 and 1871, Orston's manufactory produced about 8% of the nation's gypsum. Unfortunately, such high output exhausted the deposits of gypsum in what was actually just a 7-acre site. The works closed about 1914, and any buildings were demolished about 1930. The former pits have flooded, inevitably, and they're now a SSSI nature reserve. The surrounding land is now used as a Girl Guide campsite. It was called the Royal Plaster Works, but not because of a royal warrant, simply because it was set up by the proprietor of the Royal Oak Inn in Orston Village. Confusingly, that's since been renamed the Durham Ox. We know that in the early 19th century, gypsum was also being extracted in the nearby villages of Elton-on-the-Hill, Staunton-in-the-Vale, and slightly further away at Cropwell Bishop and Newark-on-Trent. There was also gypsum and alabaster extraction just over 20 miles away at Burton on the Wolds, which is to the east of Loughborough. Several ponds adjacent to the village in an area now known as Plantation Wood may well be flooded gypsum pits, and additional pits, now backfilled, were to the south of the village between Burton and the adjoining village of Coates. The parish registers for the nearby church at Presswold reveal several deaths in these quarries. The oldest is 1592, when Edward Stewart of Burton, described as a labourer, was digging deep into the earth and killed and dashed to pieces underneath by a movement of the earth. He was buried 22nd of July 1592. Interestingly, in February 1614, Matthias Gisborne was buried. He is described as late of Tutbury, so presumably also a gypsum worker. These two pieces of gypsum are known to have come from Burton on the Wolds and were discovered in close proximity to former extraction sites. The first reference we have to alabaster being mined in Burton on the Wolds is in William Burton's book on Leicestershire, which was published in 1622 but written about 1597. I quote, "Burton, in the 100 of East Gostot upon the side of Nottinghamshire, within this lordship not long since has been found a quarry of alabaster and white stone, serving for cutters and picture makers for statues, tombs, and proportions, but not altogether so hard and clear as that stone which is gotten in the Castle Hay Park near Tutbury, or in the quarries near Fold, adjoining, where in a mount called Nant Morble, myself have seen a rock of the same stone." Fold in Staffordshire was part of William Burton's family estate, and William retired there. I think it's reasonable to assume he knew what he was talking about. Clearly there isn't any doubt that William Burton was referring to Burton on the Wolds, since it's the only Burton in the 100 of East Goscott. However, in her book, called English Church Monuments 1510 to 1840, which was published in 1926, Catherine Esdale managed to confuse Burton on the Wolds with Burton on Trent. Since then, successive authors have used her book extensively as a source and simply repeated this error. As a result, the high-quality alabaster extracted from Burton on the Wolds around the 16th century has been undeservedly overlooked. The words of Samuel Butler, who lived between 1835 and 1902, come to mind. "It has been said that though God cannot alter the past, historians can. It is perhaps because they can be useful to him in this respect that he tolerates their existence." Presumably God has not only tolerated Miss Esdale, but has awarded her a special place in heaven. Although why God wished to write Burton on the Wolds out of history is perhaps, shall we say, as Father Dougal might have done, an ecumenical matter. Moving swiftly on, despite Miss Esdale's confusions, the stone for these excellent effigies in Quorn Church may have come from Burton on the Wolds, as the villages are only a few miles apart. There were extensive quarries to the west of Burton-on-Trent, in and around Tutbury. British Gypsum, a subsidiary of the French conglomerate Saint-Gobain, has open-cast workings at Fold to the west of Tutbury and also near Newark-on-Trent. Until very recently, British Gypsum was still extracting to the south of Newark at Kilvington, but these pits have now been flooded. The company also currently mines gypsum at Barrow-on-Soar and East Leek. Two other British gypsum mines are quite far flung, one at Kirkby Thorpe in Cumbria and the other near Robertsbridge in East Sussex. Almost all the gypsum produced these days is used in the construction industry for plasterboard, plaster, or an additive in cement. The high-purity gypsum from Kilvington and Newark is made into plaster of Paris and other specialty products used in food and brewing and pharmaceuticals and for cat litter. Sadly, there's no longer any alabaster quality gypsum being extracted, so no more sepulchral effigies or other sculpture.